E-commerce students, for our final shared experience in this online class, we're going to be talking about business-to-business e-commerce. And although this is our final chapter, it's not to say it's unimportant. It's a larger form of e-commerce than business-to-consumer. It's just a different type of e-commerce. What we're talking about are things like logistics and supply chains. Why do we spend so little time in this class talking about this aspect? Well, it's because the things we're going to be talking about have more in common with things like supply chain or logistics than what we've come to know as traditional business-to-consumer e-commerce. That is not to negate their importance. It's simply to say that if you're working within one of these fields or industries, you would find yourself in a highly specialized field working with a limited number of suppliers in a highly unique environment. So we cover this chapter more from an informational standpoint necessarily than a practice standpoint. So what are we going to be talking about? We're going to be talking about what the benefits and challenges are to doing big business between companies online, and how we get into the idea of how we add value through things like supply chain management, what some of the trends are going to be, what the trends have been based on what we've experienced since 2020. We're also going to be talking about how businesses better integrate. We mentioned things like private industrial networks earlier on in the course, but we're going to dive into them again as a reminder, how do they fit in the business-to-business world. So what are some of the trends? Well, what we've seen since 2020, we've seen massive disruptions in our supply chain. Why? Well, we've taken people out of the workforce. We've had a problem getting new supplies. We've had gluts of supply that wasn't able to be shipped because of a lack of logistical support, i.e. people driving boats or planes. And all of a sudden, we're seeing that one part of the supply chain slowing down can create a bottleneck everywhere else. At the same time, we're seeing that more people can operate anywhere in the world to find good suppliers of products or services to keep their business running. And ultimately, we as society have altered expectations going into the pandemic of what we should be able to receive. I'll give you a great example. Amazon, for years, has prided themselves on Prime 2-day shipping. When we got into the pandemic, so many people were relying on Amazon for basic necessities that was no longer possible. And we're seeing even now the Prime 2-day shipping isn't always possible based on some of the bottlenecks we've experienced in the supply chain, based on the idea that sometimes products that we want aren't as available as we wish they were. So when we start talking about B2B commerce or e-commerce, what we're really talking about is how companies buy and sell off each other. And when we talk about supply chains, how do products get from where they come from to where they need to be? How do we get supplies, raw materials? And we are a global economy, which means when there's an earthquake in Japan, the components you need for black paint on a Ford F-150 in the United States may no longer be available, meaning we have to come up with new ways to adapt and to get around some of these challenges. So how did this start? We started basically into the world of B2B e-commerce through automated order systems. So we saw in the pharmaceutical and automotive industries, for example, that we were using a lot of repeat orders for supplies, ball bearings, medicines, components. And we were able to make those automated through the use of computer networks. Ultimately, these grew into, when we say that they were serving vertical markets, what we mean by that is that we were talking about supplies that go into making products. And so a company like Amazon, for example, who calls themselves vertically integrated, means that they've got more of their supply chain integrated within their own company, as opposed to having to go over and deal with buyers or to deal with what we refer to as hub and spoke systems, where there are networks of suppliers. Ultimately, this stuff grew into, in the World Wide Web era, e-commerce websites and places where we could tie all this together. So when we look at how this has grown, the birth of automated order entries and the idea of automated fulfillment really came out of the mid to late 1970s into the 80s. Once we started getting into the 80s, we started developing standards for electronic data interchange. And what that meant was the companies that were using different types of computer systems could still talk to each other because of standards. Remember, that was one of the 8 unique aspects of e-commerce, was the idea of standards. All of a sudden, we get to the late 90s, and companies are saying, why should business consumer have all the fun on the web? And we started getting into more commercial websites, which grew into internet-based private industrial networks, so on and so forth. And now here we are in the era of mobile apps, and even social networks for business to business. So we look at how this is growing. From now until the next, well, actually, I would just say into the next decade, we're going to continue to see massive growth in this regard. Because if you've got a valuable commodity, why not sell it globally, and why not have competition from consumers, other businesses for your product? We start talking about private industrial networks. What we're talking about is how companies integrate with suppliers. Walmart is a great example here in the fact that their suppliers have to use their network to provide them with supplies. And we say non-EDI business-to-business e-commerce. What are we talking about? We're talking about web-based e-commerce, although some of the old automated order systems, the legacy systems from the 70s and 80s are continuing. So it's not been an equal impact. What it comes down to is does your company have something that people want? Is your company capable of adapting to the online marketplace and doing it at scale? And again, it comes down to the idea, if you're not ready to compete globally as a supplier, you're going to have a different level of involvement with this kind of progress than people who are. If we look at the rapid growth we've seen, obviously there's a drop-off right around 2008. Why? Because, well, we had a recession and business wasn't growing as fast as it was. It took a little hit. Well, we've come back strong. Even the dip that we thought we were going to see in 2020 really didn't come to pass because everybody's stuck at home, everybody's buying stuff online, and companies had to figure out a way to produce it. By the way, this labor shortage we're currently in right now is also spurring on further integration of e-commerce into things like automation. So we're seeing the revenue going linearly up here. So what are some of the benefits, at least the potential benefits, is that we can do more things with fewer people. We can automate. We can have lower costs, lower barriers to entry. And also, if we're using more automation, probably better quality of products, better quality overall. Then we also see that we can also have less time between new products coming around, but we've also got more competitors. We've got more people who are selling products, which also means if we are a supplier, for example, we're going to have to be competitive. We're going to have to be price competitive because the people we're dealing with can look for products and supplies elsewhere at the same time. So if we look at what happened during COVID-19, during the pandemic, what we learned is that we had some pretty weak links in our supply chain. We still do. If we think about the United States, we've got a handful of major ports of entry that were completely crippled and backlogged by what happened during COVID-19. And we've also got, for example, things that we would have never predicted. That we'd have runs on staples, that people would do panic buying, and that we would see our supply chain stressed that way. And so we've got challenges we didn't even know that we had. And ultimately, what does this reveal? It reveals that maybe as a company, if you're a business-to-business type company, maybe it's time to think about how to diversify your supply chain. And a lot of companies are even considering the following. Are we making our business vulnerable by doing nothing but business with other countries? Should we be inshoring, bringing some businesses back to the States, even if it costs us a little more or a lot more? We can have supply chains that we can count on rather than having to be vulnerable to the whims of, I shouldn't say the whims, but to the changes of global pandemic retail. So in terms of procurement, that simply means how do we buy stuff to make stuff? And the way that e-commerce affects this process, we've got more choices, we've got more automation, we've got more places globally we can go to buy the things we need to make stuff. So how does a procurement process work? Well, if you're making stuff, you're going to look through companies that make the parts that you need. So we're going to search. We're going to qualify to do business with them. We're going to get credit with them. We're also going to see if it's the best companies to deal with. We're going to negotiate and figure out what we're actually going to pay for our products. Then we fill out something called a purchase order, which is in the old days was an actual piece of paper, but we're actually ordering the process. At that point, the company we're buying from is going to send us an invoice. They're going to ship us the product, and we're going to pay for it. And a lot of the time we're buying these products on credit, meaning we've got to buy the supplies that we need, turn into products, make sales, and then we can pay what we owe to create value. And so there's several ways that we can do this. Companies, when we say we're purchasing direct goods, it means if I make shoes, if I'm buying leather, that's a direct good. An indirect good means I might be buying paper for my printers in my office, for example. We can do what we refer to as contract purchasing, which means I'm going to set up a long-term deal with another company. I'm buying all of supply X from you. Or spot purchasing, which means I might need to buy something one time or once in a while from a supplier that I'm not going to have so much of a long-term relationship with. I may be buying that from a larger marketplace with more competition as well. So again, it takes a lot of work. If you're somebody who enjoys negotiating, if you're somebody who enjoys paperwork, if you enjoy contracts, let me tell you, there are careers out there, because it's not something that just anybody can do. It's not always a straightforward process. It can be very time intensive. It can be very stressful. And if you're one of these people who enjoys being a buyer, for example, purchasing and sales are not what you think they are. With the stereotypes of sales being working with people who don't want your product, that's absolutely not true in a business-to-business environment. In fact, you're selling to people who need your product to be able to make their product. So when we start talking about a multi-tier supply chain, it means that we might be getting products from a variety of different places. If you're Ford Motor Company, for example, and you're making an F-150, the aluminum for that bed is coming from one place, the parts of the transmission are coming from another, the tires are coming from someplace else, and they may all be on different companies, from different companies, with different production schedules, and at this point in time, different disruptions. And so managing the logistics, again, if you like this stuff, boy, there are opportunities for you. If you look at a multi-tier supply chain, you're talking about basically you're buying from multiple vendors. And we say tier 3, tier 2, and tier 1. That means you could be buying parts from tier 3 that go into components made by tier 2, which are purchased by you in tier 1 and converted into a product. We also have older systems that are still around. We call them legacy systems. What does that mean? Well, your company's been around since the 80s, and so is the database that it's powered on. It might not even be web capable, which means sometimes you need middleware to be able to make these systems talk to other systems. Then we get into what we refer to as enterprise systems. That simply means we are integrating all aspects of our company. We talked earlier about how things like procurement, finance, and HR can be rolled into a comprehensive system. What does that mean? Well, if I'm Amazon.com and I can see that I'm fulfilling orders for these kinds of products from these warehouses, I might need more staff in those places. And I might need finance to be involved because I need to recruit people for a higher wage than I'm currently paying. And all of this gets integrated with your business processes because the money you're pulling in and the money you're pulling out and the products you're making or distributing have to be done in concert. So what are some of the trends that we're seeing? What we're seeing right now is more people essentially wanting redundancy. Some of the other things we're seeing in supply chain management, for example, we call it just-in-time or lean production. That means if you're buying product, if you're warehousing it, it costs you money to keep a product around or a supply around that you're not selling. I will say there's been some pushback in that regard because some companies are also realizing right now it can be a very dangerous thing if you don't have product as well. It can be a very dangerous thing if you don't have the supplies that you actually need. So maybe having a little bit of extra inventory sitting around isn't always such a bad thing. So that has been something that maybe is not quite a universal kind of opinion at this point in time, that lean manufacturing is always good, or lean production. But we're also seeing that more people are trying to keep additional supplies on hand because of the world we're living in and because of the disruptions we've seen. We start talking about supply chain simplification. That means, for example, you may want to buy from fewer numbers of suppliers, build long-term relationships, and even be able to have the products you're buying arrive at the exact right time. So again, you're not maintaining multiple warehouses and multiple supply chains. Again, just-in-time or lean production, meaning you're keeping fewer things sitting around just collecting dust. And it's something we talk about. There's even a project management methodology called Lean Six Sigma, for example, that emphasizes this kind of work. And this was a very popular mindset, especially prior to 2020, because of things like Lean Six Sigma. And what we're talking about here really changed when we hit 2020. Again, why? Because people realized all of a sudden that maybe there was some value to simply having excess products sitting around so that you weren't caught in a lurch whenever you could not, for example, produce product because you didn't have supplies. So what are some of the risks right now? The risks right now, if you don't have inventory, if your supplier goes down because of an outbreak or because of a backlog in the supply chain, what are you going to do? You better have alternatives. And people who are creative, who can come up with alternatives in the supply chain, are people who will be very valuable to companies. And that's where we get into what we refer to as adaptive supply chains. Our book does a good job of explaining this, but what we mean essentially are supply chains that can change suppliers. For example, maybe I've got multiple suppliers of ball bearings. Maybe I've got other companies that are my backups. Maybe at certain points in time, I'm willing to go to a higher cost supplier to be able to produce product, and I've built that amount of slack in my product pricing so that I can still make a profit even if I got to pay more for supplies. Welcome to the 21st century supply chain. We start talking about accountability. This is where we get into a little bit of the ethical and moral implications. Because we've got supplies coming from around the world, we don't always know where our products are coming from and who's making them. And we're starting to see more pushback from consumers now that say they want things to be made in fair and equitable scenarios, meaning we've got a lot of places around the world. If you enjoy chocolate or smartphones, there's a good chance that some of the cocoa that's gone into your chocolate or the battery that's in your iPhone may have been produced by either forced or child labor. These are all kinds of things we need to think about. And again, more people are looking under the hood, and they're looking at things like the Fair Labor Association and other groups that hold companies accountable. We start talking about sustainable supply chains. At its root, sustainability does not always mean environmentalism. Sustainability means it's a product or a service that can be maintained over time. Your company can do things in a profitable manner. But we also think about it in an environmental standpoint. The idea being, are people contributing to global warming? Are people making sure to be environmentally safe? There are things that get beyond just the idea of profitability as well. And so there is a push for our supply chains also to be sustainable as well, while creating value for the people involved. We talked about EDI. Suffice it to say that the early e-commerce interactions for business to business were empowered by the idea that we had standards-based systems that could talk to each other. And again, this is something that has its legacy back to the 70s and 80s when big companies were first getting involved in this. How did this evolve? Well, the original EDI systems, literally, a supplier and a farm computer had some level of automation. It literally would turn orders into printouts, which we would still take back and forth. Then we get to the idea of document elimination. We get into the 90s, and all of a sudden there's direct communication between the two. And we get into where we're at right now. It simply means it's not just through the suppliers. We're going directly to multiple suppliers because we've gone to web-based systems under scenario number 3. Now we're getting into the idea that we can do business-to-business types of interactions on our smartphones. Because we've got mobile apps, and more people are relying on personal devices to be able to manage supply chains for their companies all the time. Again, a lot of these services, even procurement, have migrated to be software as a service. We're going out into the cloud. Why? Because we can. And we're no longer limited by lugging around a large laptop. So long as we've got internet connectivity, which is basically ubiquitous in much of the world at this point in time, we can literally manage our supply chain from just about anywhere. That's what's empowering B2B e-commerce. In terms of supply chain management systems, again, you're going to find these to be very unique from one company to the next. So when I cover this, I don't mean to say that it's not important by the length at which we're covering it. Meaning I'm covering it briefly. It just means whatever company you work for is going to have their own supply chain management system, whether they're buying it from Oracle or SAP or whatever manufacturer. It's going to be tailored to the industry within which you're working, because every industry's got its own requirements. So a supply chain management system simply means we have a way to make sure that we know where our supplies to produce products are coming from, where they're going to, and how frequently we can expect them. If we are a business that's a customer for another business, we should be able to automatically order and replenish our supplies. And again, it's just like, think about it as Amazon for companies buying from other companies. There's a lot of push to say, hey, what about blockchain? What value could we have with blockchain? What do we mean by that? Well, what we mean is when we think about things like Bitcoin. We think about things like friction-free commerce. The idea, instead of having to go through an intermediary and electronic data interchange, why can't I just electronically move Bitcoin or other kinds of digital currency between companies? It's immediate payment, it's secure, it's tracked, it's non-reputable, meaning that we have that element of non-repudiation. We know where the transaction is coming from, and we could ultimately have much faster transactions. Will large companies adopt a blockchain in this regard? Time will tell, but it definitely has its perks. We start talking about collaborative commerce. What we mean at this point in time is, we mentioned earlier that there are customer co-creations, the idea that, hey, I can buy in a business-to-consumer setting, I can buy from Nike and create a custom pair of Nikes. More companies are starting to wonder, why don't we do this? One of the best examples I can think of, I love cars. I love talking about cars. I love the changing history of cars. GM and Ford went together on a joint venture to make a transmission for their large pickup trucks. That's right. A lot of Fords and Chevys basically have the same transmission. We had Toyota and BMW had a joint venture to create a sports car. And so this is enabling more collaborative commerce between companies because this kind of information sharing and even design work has been enabled through the systems we're talking about here in terms of determining who's building what, where the supplies will come from. It really is empowering. And so we get into the idea of a collaborative design system. What we're really talking about is to have some sort of project management system between companies. I would even go as far as to say what Walmart is doing with some of their industrial networks, for example, are enabling more collaboration with them and their suppliers, and we're seeing the same thing now with bigger companies that are collaborating in this regard. We also see that there are social networks that are at play here. For example, people who are using either Facebook or I know our text at times regards YouTube as a social network. Not sure I totally agree with that designation, but these are ways of sharing content and ideas and spurring on e-commerce between businesses. So we could say that definitely happens to this regard. Again, we get into business-to-business marketing. All the same things that make marketing more possible in the business-consumer realm are the same things that help out business-to-business marketing as well. We are seeing things like direct advertising or pay-per-click advertising, for example. In fact, if you get into the pay-per-click advertising model in terms of lead generation, all that sort of stuff we talked about in earlier chapters, some business-to-business companies will pay big money per click to get the right people looking at their supplies. If I am selling high-end cleaning supplies, for example, and I can get the attention of somebody who does purchasing or procurement for a large hotel chain, that's worth a few cents per click. And again, we get into predictive analytics. Our established customers, their previous buying habits, if they've been buying the following cleaning products from us for years, they might like these upcoming products. So the same stuff is coming to pass. We talked about net marketplaces, for example, the idea of where companies buy. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because we covered it in pretty good depth early on in the class. But an e-distributor essentially is an online version of a parts distributor. E-procurement means you might be paying somebody as a service-based scenario to do things like procurement and HR for you. Exchanges. We get into the idea of buying large amounts of raw materials. In industry consortia, we got very specific, the airline industry, the automobile industry come to mind, large companies that can only purchase from specific other companies, and they don't want to waste their time in smaller markets. And so, again, we get into these net marketplaces. What we're talking about essentially are places that are fairly closed off to the general public because they're meant for business-to-business, people buying in bulk. And we talked about these in terms of an e-distributor. Granger's a great example of that. An independent exchange, Power Source Online or Go to Paper, they sell, again, to specific industries. E-procurement, Ariba, is a company that will do everything from purchase to HR for you. And industry consortia, if you are in the airline or automobile industry, you might be buying more off there. You can see, for example, the further you go to the right, you've got more vertical markets, which means these are vertically integrated, which means very specialized types of customers. Where anybody, any type of business might need an e-distributor, very specific types of businesses will be working with industry consortia. And so again, we covered this pretty well, I think. E-distributors are online versions of typical distributors. We're buying from large catalogs of large supplies. Net marketplaces, for example, we talked about the idea of getting into buying services. That's a big part of the model. Exchanges, again, you have large amounts of suppliers, and these are tough because price competition got so fierce that a lot of companies simply couldn't compete. If you're buying in bulk, if you're buying ball bearings from somebody, for example, there might be 200 companies trying to cut each other's throat to be able to make the sale. So they were difficult because the competition got too intense. And finally, industry consortia, again, very specific types of places to buy supplies and components for very specific industry. We mentioned, for example, Walmart in terms of a private industrial network. These were essentially the types of networks that grew out of the original electronic data interchanges. And so we're talking about essentially networks where companies that are buying large amounts of supplies can directly integrate with their suppliers to be able to purchase. So again, in the old days, those would have been EDIs, databases talking to each other. We're talking about more detailed, more process-oriented versions of order fulfillment systems between companies. Sometimes it can be a little tough to tell where one company ends and where another begins. What's the idea? The idea is to reduce friction, increase efficiency, and increase speed. So Procter & Gamble, again, does the same thing as Walmart does in terms of getting components from their suppliers to sell to customers, ultimately. And so we get into the idea of collaborative commerce. What that means is a company like Walmart or a company like Procter & Gamble is also partnering with their suppliers to try to predict when they're going to need things. If you're Walmart and you're buying stuff for Christmas, for example, you want to make sure that those kinks are worked out before you get into October, November, December. That's not something you do just by placing orders, because your suppliers themselves may not even realize how great your need is. So again, all of this stuff fits together in terms of collaborative commerce and the fact that we're going to try to predict what we're going to need. And that's something that companies that are buying from suppliers, for example, are going to have to do that in a way that's collaborative. In terms of our supply chain visibility, are we being honest with our suppliers about where we need to get things from and redundancy? In terms of demand chain, do we know, for example, where if we need more supplies to make products for other companies, where it's coming from? Marketing coordination. Are we selling to one company with our business-to-business product or multiple? In product design, there are going to be times we collaborate as business-to-business companies to make something happen together. What are some of the barriers? Well, the more you share information, you're sharing competitive secrets. If Walmart, for example, shares how its logistics system works with its suppliers can leverage that to get additional customers. And so these are industry secrets, for example. Sometimes the old systems we've been counting on for years that have worked well, it's hard to take a system down that you're using every day and to upgrade it, because you could have problems and all of a sudden the new latest and greatest system doesn't work as well as your old system. The flip side is if you don't upgrade your old system, eventually it'll break too. So sooner or later, we're all doing some level of collaboration here. That's really the name of the game. And with that being the last slide in our last lecture, I thank you for your time and hard work in this class. Hope I get to run into you in the real world someday. Have a great day.